Chill on that. You don't count me, so you're already cold. So I'm going to move on to another segment of the book here. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross and the whole topic of near-death experiences and life after death. How many of you have heard of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross? Yes, yes. Wow, I'm blown away by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. For those who don't know her or just need a quick refresher course, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross wrote on death and dying. She is the lady that became the public face of the national and international hospice movement. It's a terrific book, a tough read. She sat by the bedsides of people who were dying, who were terminally ill, and listened to their stories. And she was the first person to really collect those stories, think about the patterns within them, and broadcast them to a larger audience. And this was at a time not in our not so distant past when Western medicine in particular kind of neglected the terminally ill, didn't look at them as people at all, but just sort of husks to keep alive, didn't deal with the emotional trauma of what they were going through, and oftentimes, in fact, usually in Kubler-Ross's experience, didn't even tell people their diagnosis, that they were in fact dying. So let me read you a short section here. My mother's death is in part what drew me into investigating Kubler-Ross. As my mother slowly succumbed to a long-term illness, nothing at all paranormal happened, but I did receive the benefit of Kubler-Ross's work, rereading on death and dying over a couple of difficult days. The story she tells of a farmer is the one that haunted me. The farmer she describes took his beloved wife to a big city hospital in the hope of saving her. He wanted to spend every minute with her. He wanted to sit beside her during the day and sleep beside her at night, but he was not allowed to stay in the intensive care unit for more than 5 minutes an hour. He took what he could get, coming and going under orders, staring at his wife's white face, and holding her hand till he was told to leave. In contrast, nearly 40 years later, my family was allowed to stay with my mother everywhere and at all times, when she was in a private room and when she was in intensive care. My father, married to my mother for 50 years, issued a simple order. Your mother asked that she never be left alone, he said. So that's it. We're not going to leave her alone. And we didn't. She had a family member by her side in the hospital 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My father logged the vast majority of hours. The nurses and doctors were so taken with his dedication that they eventually put my mother in a private room and made a bed next to her for my father to sleep in. I think of the old man Kubler-Ross described who could not stay with his wife for any extended period of time and feel so tremendously grateful that at the end we were able to spend this time with my mother. On maybe the most emotional of those days, my sister Karen and I spent an hour or two sitting on either side of my mother's bed. My father had recently discovered the hospital television included an easy listening music channel. I can't remember what song was playing, but we sat on either side of my mother, each holding one of her hands. My mother sang a little. Her voice was weak. She asked Karen to sing for her. As Karen's voice rose, my mother closed her eyes. She smiled. "Isn't this cozy?" she said. "Isn't this nice? We'd never have done this if we were home." So the Kubler-Ross story meant a lot to me just on the surface, the story that everyone's really familiar with about her. But there's more to the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross story. And one of the great joys for me of researching the book is I got to talk to her research partner, the Reverend Mwalimu Amara, a wonderful guy. I'm hoping we get a chance to meet him in person. He accompanied her on all of her walks through the hospital. The administration felt like she needed somebody with her who was also an employee as a show of support, because the hospital staff was so against her actually going in and saying to the terminally ill, "Hey, how are you feeling? What is this like for you?" So here's the thing though, they weren't just collecting stories about people suffering, at least those weren't the only stories they were hearing. They also started hearing stories about what we now take to be classic near-death experiences, years before that phrase was coined. This would be in the mid-60s, mid to late 60s. People who had been resuscitated would, once they were recovered, would say that they saw their resuscitation. They would seem to describe it completely accurately. They would describe leaving their bodies. They would describe at times being pulled into or entering a tunnel, visiting another realm, meeting with deceased relatives and friends. And at first, Kubler-Ross and Amara, the Reverend, dismissed this entirely as fantasy when they were first hearing this, because that's the reaction we all normally have, is to rationalize this stuff. But then they heard the stories like this, not once, not twice, but 3 times, but 4, 5, and again and again. And they realized, well, wait a second, if we're cataloging everything else, if we're cataloging all these other patterns that are emerging that our patients have to say, we should write this down as well. So, by the time we pick up here, this would be around 1968, and she has a contract to write her book. By this time, Kubler-Ross had accumulated enough stories about NDEs and deathbed visitations that she was giving serious consideration to publishing them, along with her famous psychological stages. In fact, according to Amara, in its original incarnation, Kubler-Ross wrote a concluding chapter to On Death and Dying in which she detailed numerous near-death experiences. As might be expected, given the closeness of their professional relationship, she asked Reverend Amara to give the manuscript one last look. Her husband Manny and the children were asleep, so it was just the 2 of them, up late at night in her house, going over manuscript pages, patching in quotes, and tweaking sentences. But the most important conversation of the evening was about the last chapter. The room was filled with smoke from Kubler-Ross's cigarette addiction, Amara remembers, and they had long since moved on from tea to whiskey sours. "Do I put this chapter in?" asked Kubler-Ross. "Not if you want it published," replied Amara. "You don't tell them about the kid on the 2nd floor who spoke to his dead sister. You don't talk about getting into someone's house after they died and finding a picture he drew with a map and a clock of the exact time and place of his death. You don't do it. That will not fly." Kubler-Ross was already taking on an incredibly taboo topic, death. The idea that she might end a book that already challenged the biases of the powerful medical profession with an "oh, by the way" chapter, suggesting the possibility of an afterlife, would have been way, way too much. Her entire life's work would have been dismissed, and in her last chapter, she would have given the people the means with which to attack her. The house was quiet, and so were they. This was a pivotal discussion, and both of them knew it. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was not someone who routinely cared what cultural or political forces were at play. She only cared about what she took to be the truth. But in this case, the stakes were so high, the suffering she had seen among her patients so great, she agreed. She would hang on to this chapter. She would put these tales of the dying on a shelf.